Well, hello, welcome back. If you were with me last week, you know we just began a brand new study. Last week we didn't get too far. We mainly set the scene. We went back from 1 Timothy in the New Testament to about 3,000 years ago, to an Old Testament book, and it's a second Samuel, so it's the second book. It's, if you will, a sequel to the first book. It's really a continuing story of the life of David. However, each week, besides the history, the chronology, there'll be lessons from it. And so one of the lessons this week is dealing with grief. Have you ever had loss in your life? Are you currently dealing with loss? Have you had grief? Have you had to deal with hard things? Well, David was not immune from that. One thing that we see in the Bible is the greatest people had loss. The greatest people had grief, just as we do today. So multiple things going on today. The history lesson, the narrative of David's life, but many lessons as well, including one of those lessons is dealing with grief. Now, I'm not going to take a lot of time, but I do want to, since it's only the second week in it, make sure we understand just a couple of minutes of the background and history. Again, we're going back about 3,000 years to go to roughly 1,000 years before Christ. And what the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel are looking at is the history of Israel, including the rise of the prophet Samuel, the first king, Saul, the earthly king, the human king, the king chosen because of his physical appearance and looking the part, as leaders sometimes are still chosen today, not always on the substantive issues. But now, what we're going to be seeing much more so, David was definitely a big part of the first book of Samuel, but he's going to have even a much more prominent part here in the second book of Samuel. And it's going to be about the expansion of the kingdom. We are in the land of the Middle East and Israel. And we also, though, have others. The Amalekites are going to be a big part of the story that we're going to see today. But the kingdom is going to be expanded. And we're going to learn a lot about David's life as a king, but also at a personal level, victories and failures. And I certainly don't want to take too long again. You can go back and look at 1 Samuel. You can see my summary, but short story is the rise of the earthly King Saul. He had issues in his life. He had some highs. He had many lows. He had mental instability. He had tremendous anger, personal anger towards David. He even tried to harm him many times. And David had even been an outcast. But 1 Samuel ends with the loss of Saul, which is going to be part of the scene that we're picking up on today in 2 Samuel 1. So in the very first verse, it says, after the death of Saul, he died, in the last book of 1 Samuel. And David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, who were continually in battle and enemy with Israel. And where David is at, as we pick up the story, is he is in Ziklag, the Middle East. And these are current pictures of it. It's a place where there's still ongoing archaeology and historical records, which we don't have to have, but they do validate the Bible. What's happening, though, is this strange man is just coming in to the scene, and he had come, it says, from Saul's camp, with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. A couple of things about this. Coming from Saul's camp, David doesn't know. David doesn't know what has happened. And with his clothes torn and dirt on his head, that's a sign that could very well be a sign, an indication of bad news, of death even. And we also see the respect he is showing David here. He falls to the ground, when he's paying homage. he's kind of throwing himself at the feet of David. I think he's trying to, and we'll see more about it, ingratiate himself with David. And so David said to him, "Where do you come from?" He said, "I've escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said to him, "Well, how did it go? Tell me." Remember, he doesn't have the news. He doesn't have the news about Saul. He doesn't have the news of how the battle is even going with his people. Well, he just lays it on him bluntly. Lots of bad news. The people fled from the battle, and many of the people have fallen and are dead. Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead. I mean, think about the ramifications. You want to talk about a day of loss. This is loss after loss after loss. And to further give you insight into this, Jonathan, you may remember, is the son of Saul, but also David's very best friend, the friend that he loved closer than a brother. And then he's worried about his nation. So as we left off last time, it was a cliffhanger. The personal loss. And though there had been this animosity with Saul, they had had a close relationship, a friendship, a mentorship. David played music for him, gave counsel to him. Jonathan, again, was his closest friend, so he's got this personal loss. But it's also the loss of the king. He was the first king. What is the plans for a new king and the nation itself? And who was responsible? He didn't know how it happened. And you can't help but think about, just like we would in our own country, if the president has fallen. Whether we like them, don't like them, it's still a serious issue. And what if another country had done it? That could mean war. So, yeah, there's a lot. Let's just say it was a time of grief, loss, and a scary time. So, we pick things up. David has a question, which I want to say is wise. Before we overly react, sometimes before we jump to conclusions, it is a smart thing to ask a question. So he doesn't know, but he's testing him out a little bit. So how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? He's going to give him a chance. David's not jumping to conclusions. He's going to let this man say it himself. And there's multiple things to think about here. The young man said to him, "Well, by chance, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa. And there was Saul, leaning on his spear. And behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him." Now, we're going to dig into this a lot more. But just think, well, by chance I was in the middle of this battle. And by chance I happened to be right there next to the king. Yeah, okay. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me. And I said, "Well, here I am, just saying hi to the king." And he said to me, "Well, who are you?" And I said, "Well, I am an Amalekite." Now, again, the scene of Mount Gilboa is in fact the scene of the battle in 1 Samuel 31. There's some truth and there's some error mixed in here. Saul was indeed there on Mount Gilboa. That's also true. Some things are going to turn out to not be true. Let's not skip over this idea of the Amalekites. They were in that initial map. They were part of the people battling for the land. And there's a lot of history here. Amalek is really, not just often, really pretty much continuously is the enemy of God's people. Maybe if we were to create an analogy with us over the last, 60 or 70 years in America, there's been battles, or at least some kind of tensions with Russia. There's always something going on. So there's that. And then really, I think there's some credible reasons we would say that Amalek, the Amalekites, really represent the flesh. They represent our carnal nature, and I think that's part of what we see in this chapter as well, with David representing the spiritual man, and this man and the Amalekites representing kind of our flesh. And there's a lot we can look at. I won't share it all, but throughout Deuteronomy, Exodus, Numbers, Judges, we see this idea of Amalek humanly focusing on the tired and the weak, just like this man's trying to, I think, ingratiate himself to David. Amalek does not fear God. They're in a state of war. God says there should always be a battle there. The only way it can be won is by prayer and seeking God. That's the only way we can overcome our enemies, our flesh. So it's good just to quickly be reminded of this history. Now the man's still telling his story, and I'm going to show you he is actually telling lies. So he's back to telling his story with Saul, and he says, Saul says, stand beside me and kill me? So he's saying that to Amalekite? For anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers. So he says with his own mouth, so I stood beside him and I killed him. He says, I was sure he wasn't going to live after he'd fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord. Now, again, truth and error. Truth is he had the physical crown. Obviously, there had been something there. And he had the armlet, and these were the signs of the king. These were precious possessions. And he said, here they are, Lord, I'm giving them to you. I think he's really saying, and now reward me. But first, I want to call out his lies. Because if we go back, and this is a good thing to do regardless, to 1 Samuel 31, here's the true story of what had happened. Now the Philistines, more enemies of God's people, were fighting against Israel. And the men of Israel fled before the Philistines, and they fell slain on Mount Gilboa. So that was the place, the battle. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan. Now there's his death. He was killed by the Philistines, along with Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. Then it goes on and says, the battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. And Saul said to his armor-bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men on the same day together. 2 points. First, that man's not there, the one telling the story. And this is what really happened. Also, notice Saul's death. David didn't take his life. Really, I think it's a fitting ending. Saul ended up taking his own life. It's a sad end. But that young man's story was not true. What about David's reaction? David said, wow, yay, my enemy has fallen. He could have said, you will be rewarded handsomely. But we see David's reaction as that of the man after God's own heart, the Spirit. I believe this is genuine. He took his clothes, he tore them, genuine grief like you would for a family member, for a close friend, as these were. He was a leader, and so his men followed suit. And our reactions can often impact others. This was a key point in the nation. They all grieved. They mourned. They wept. They fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel. Tremendous loss. There is a time of loss. There is a time of mourning. There is a time of grief. And that's part of our life. So I opened at the beginning about dealing with grief. Grief is part of what we endure in this human world, and David had to endure it as well. But I want to show you this too. In his flesh, he could have celebrated. Saul had tried 21 times to harm him, to kill him. David had opportunities to get revenge, to take his life, but he would not. And now he is genuinely grieving for his close friend, for his king, for the people, for all that. It's a scary time. There is a very large amount of things happening personally, militarily, the people. But this shows you David's heart. And I just wanted to show you this briefly. 1 Samuel, when he could have taken things into his own hands, when his flesh could have taken that, the Lord forbid I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put my hand against him. Over and over, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, he is the Lord's anointed. Who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? Over and over. 1 Samuel 26:23, the Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord gave you into my hand today, and I would not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. David was not perfect, but he was consistently faithful, and he did not let his flesh overtake him in this. Which was a contrast, which is the fate of the flesh and this fleshly man and his schemes. And he had that crown, he had that armlet. He really thought, I'm going to get me a great reward today. But instead, there is a truth. Be sure your sins will find you out. And so David said to the young man who told him, where do you come from? And he answered, well, I'm the son of a sojourner, and I am an Amalekite. And David said to him, how is it you are not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? That's what we just saw. David is not a hypocrite here. David had had many opportunities, but he never took them. Now the man still was telling a lie in all this, but yet with his own words, he said he had destroyed it. Then David called one of the young men and said, go and execute him. And he struck him down so that he died. And here's what David said. Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. Well, this is where we're going to take a pause this week. We'll pick up here next week. There's a lot to think about with grief. I think there's also a lot to think about with the man of the spirit versus the man of the flesh, and the wrestling match we all face. You know, everything is in God's hands. David saw that. That's why he did not take matters into his own hands. This man operating the flesh, thinking he had a clever scheme, ended up condemning himself to death. We need to understand that whether we're a king, a future king, a president, a future president, whether we're just an everyday person, as we mostly are, yet everything is in God's hands. We've got to battle the Amalekites of our flesh. We got to balance this constant struggle. We need to stay spiritual. We can get angry with people. If anybody could get angry, David had every right to be. If there was ever a case to be angry with a person, David could towards Saul. Yet, he still showed him respect, and he still grieved. And then that's the last thing I'll share on. Part of our life, sadly, is dealing with grief in this world. And there are times we have to mourn and weep. And what we're going to see next week is actually the eulogy that David is going to give for the loss of Saul and Jonathan. And it's a beautiful picture, and there's a lot that we can learn from it. I hope you can think about these things. I hope you can continue to follow the narrative with me, and we have lots more to explore in the light.